The cosmic artisan. Contemporary practice. In contemporary culture, handicraft is everywhere. Architects have rediscovered the values of craft in post-iconic times, while artists have developed a renewed interest in the material process of making things. As activists have reverted to craft graffiti or craftivism, hipsters are meeting in specialized knitting cafes. Television spills over with cooking shows. Internet theorists celebrate the culture of craft in anything from the open source software to Web 2.0 to the Fab Lab. In the slipstream of the slow movements, social philosophers implement the ethos of the craftsperson in city renovation projects. With predictable regularity, new exhibitions about the current state of craft open their doors to enthusiastic crowds. The artisanal turn is not just a symptom of postmodern nostalgia that is past options or instances allowed to make a second appearance. Rather, it is our very experience of time that has changed. What seemed old can appear authentically new again. Capital does not just undo old ties, it also remakes them on its own terms. The art of the contemporary that comes after postmodernism involves a kind of internal retreat of the modern to the present. Instead of the modernist new, the avant-gardist tomorrow, and the postmodern end of history, contemporary practice inhabits an asynchronous present that we can call meta-modern, where meta is understood in its etymological sense of among, a heterogeneity of material, technical, social, political, digital practices which in their disjunctive togetherness express and construct the contemporary. One of the things I just hit on there are knitting cafes, board game cafes, things like that. But the website Etsy, basically people can make craft things on there and then sell them. The problem is the website, if you want to create something and sell it, you are beholden to selling it in one of those big third-party websites, and they take a huge amount of money from the actual creators. I'd imagine around 20 to 25%. It is unreasonable, not tenable for people to, by being like that, it keeps it as a craft project and it keeps it on the outside. But then if you had a craft project, once it crosses over and becomes a company, then it's no longer like a outsider counterculture thing. It is then reified into the mainstream. The meta-modern interest in craft and craftsmanship thus has less to do with the idealization of pre-industrial handicrafts by John Ruskin or the anti-industrial arts and crafts movement founded by William Morris, and with the Bauhaus. Because England was the first country to industrialize, it was the first to have counter movements against people realized what they were losing. And in fact, in the Netherlands, the trade guilds were only abolished in 1795. So you had in Europe a lot of things that were still really controlled by guilds. And because England industrialized first, then Europe got the technology. And then they really liked the theory and ideas of Ruskin and Morris, who were the first people to point out they are contemporary people to Karl Marx, like they're around the same time. But then the interesting statement is saying that the current meta-modern interest, part of it is like Ruskin and Morris, we live with a degree of late sentimentality. We're still part of the romantic, let's say at the end of the last century, people like Fry Harold Bloom, who we were talking about before in the literature. People still had this, maybe now it's gone on in the early 2000s into kitsch, age, but we still live in the last glow of the Romantic. It's interesting for him to say then that this is more connected to the Bauhaus rather than with the original movement of Ruskin and Morris.
Bauhaus has more capital investment in it versus small handicraft.
You had that arts and craft movement and you had the Art Nouveau. If you imagine the Art Nouveau art movement called the Jugendstil in Netherlands, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, it was really a counter movement against mass production. It was a wanting of a return to finer quality handcrafted goods. So you had buildings with a lot of carved stone, hand painted tiles, beautiful woodwork. But World War One rose up, but the movement was already waning. It's a really interesting thing that he says there about the Bauhaus. When you think of Bauhaus, you think of the ribbon windows on buildings and these organic rounded corners on modern buildings and the ladder windows with this crisscross, and then the mass production of those chairs and tables and things. In the Netherlands, if you think about the in between to this, there is Piet Mondrian and the abstract coloured squares. And then the other person in the movement with him was a guy called Theo van Doesburg. And if you've seen the De Stijl chair, they are also influenced by Van Doesburgers, by the arts and crafts movement. And you've also got other people in the Dutch one, a guy called Berlacher, and he has a furniture and an interior design firm with a guy called Jacob van den Bosch. They were creating beautiful wood furniture, but it was too expensive for people to buy in that period. Van Doesburg is really the very last point of arts and crafts, where then it just gets absorbed and reified into the system of mass production. And that's just after World War One, in the interwar period, before 1920. And then you have the Bauhaus comes out around that time as well. But it's interesting that he's neglecting some of the people who are, like Berlacher was very, very influential in Germany. He would go and lecture over in Germany. So it's interesting he doesn't see roots of it in the Netherlands, where he's writing from.
The time period might be important too after World War One. So during World War One, a lot of the materials would probably be going to the war effort, and there wouldn't really be much availability of materials to really try out new furniture styles. But after the war ends, then you'd have a opening up of these resources and allowance for trying to create a new furniture style, and you would have probably also had more of a demand for it because people would have more money and would be looking for something to take their mind off the recent war, say purchasing new furniture to fill the house with.
That's true, and part of it is simply that part of the modern industrial project is distributing the goods to the people. So in the earlier times, people moved into the city, and then in the next period they raised up a little bit and they got what were seen as the goods of the higher classes in the period before. And the same thing happens here, where say people didn't have a clock in their house. Now with the De Stijl and the Bauhaus, they could fabricate chairs on a mass scale, like bending wood and bending tube steel and clocks being made on a factory line. So now people could have affordable furniture and clocks. It was distributing the goods to the people who'd moved into the cities to work into the factories. It's like a slow filtering down or distribution of the things.
This goes back to the Charles Eames documentary that I was watching before, which is where I got that idea that the ending of the war would allow for an opening up of trying new furniture, artistic styles. But it's interesting that you mentioned chairs, because that was Charles Eames' first big project, to create a chair for the modern family that was different from the Victorian style chairs that everybody had during that time with upholstery and stuff like that. But the funny thing was, the chair won the contest that they were putting it into, or the award, but the way that it was made could not be mass produced. And so it was basically a complete failure because the point was to get it into people's houses to become the style of modern America, and you couldn't produce the chair. It was unreproducible, and it goes back to the importance of something Sajord said, the importance of preferencing substance over modes, because basically Eames started out with the idea and then made the substance fit the idea, and that was a mistake that he said he would never make again. He would always start from the material of the thing, the substance of the thing, and have the artistic creation come about from that.
For Ruskin and Morris, the basic idea had been that craftsmanship guarantees workers' control over the means and relations of production and thus enables them to retain their traditional form of life. Bauhaus, by contrast, was probably the first major attempt to combine specialized craft workshops with industrial manufacturing and capital investments, and hence conceptualize modern craft vis-a-vis the historically specific social situation of labor. It raised questions that are still relevant for post-industrial times, and that any investigation and reconsideration of the meanings and values of craft for the 21st century has to answer. Is the revival of the crafts solely a moment of nostalgia or a movement with a future? What is the relationship between art, craft, and design? What is the relation between manual labor and computer-aided assemblage? How do values of craft, such as spirituality, authenticity, responsibility, purity, intimacy, customization, care, assiduity, mindfulness, truthfulness, inventiveness, localness, spontaneity, skill, sustainability, health, conviviality, virtue, passion, pertain to communities of human and non-human actors? In what sense could craftsmanship, making things ourselves or doing a job well for its own sake, be an alternative to consumerism in times of austerity? In order to explore at least some of these questions, as well as raise new ones, they must be situated within recent developments in contemporary art and design. After the militant mediation of taste, the avant-gardes, in the early 20th century, followed by decades of conceptual art, today there is a renewed fascination with raw materials, while artists are exploring the experimental rhythm of problem solving and problem finding that makes the ancient potter and the modern programmer members of the same tribe. Design theorists are reading Diderot's encyclopedia, in which artisanal occupations and mental labor, physical activity, and processes of reflection and feeling are treated on a par. After Romantic production aesthetics, modernist work aesthetics, and postmodern reception aesthetics, it seems that our understanding of art and design takes the form of a pure pragmatics. If the ontology of the work of art is transformed from the modern craft-based ontology of media to a post-conceptual, trans-categorical ontology of materializations, this transformation marks less the disappearance of craftsmanship at the end of art than art's further development into media literacy. The renewed interest in crafts and craftsmanship answers to the need for a new practice-based and object-oriented knowledge. Given a certain material, what are its possible and virtual functions? Already in the 1970s, the prefixes artist and designer began to be added to domains that used to be part of the applied arts. For example, interior design of old, the heartland of craft. At the same time, decolonization processes revealed the global significance of the applied arts. Ever since, craft has been emancipating itself from the intimacy of the studio and corresponding closed guild mind that values only the specifics of its métier, its abilities, skills, customs, and recipes. Instead of a concern with labor, whether that particular form of labor that goes by the name of art or any other modern form of life and its skills, the question of craft now seems to be synonymous with our engagement with matter and everyday life. It is in this metamodern sense that we can return to the concept of the modern artist as cosmic artisan, proposed by Deleuze and Guattari. Creativity, the new, is not an absolute beginning, but a problem of consistency and duration, of assembling heterogeneous elements into a synergetically functioning aggregate. It is no longer a matter of imposing a form upon a matter, but of elaborating an increasingly rich and consistent material, better to tap increasingly intense forces. What makes a material increasingly rich is the same as what holds heterogeneities together without their ceasing to be heterogeneities. Crucially, this procedure of enrichment has nothing to do with any socio-political or other pre-established division of labor. The cosmic artisan does not oppose art in favor of life, but art as a form of life, as an already socio-political project. She is the revolutionary knitter who understands skill and technologies as free actions directly wedded to a material movement that exceeds her on all sides. The modern figure is not the child or the lunatic, still less the artist, but the cosmic artisan, a homemade atomic bomb. To be an artisan and no longer an artist, creator, or founder is the only way to become cosmic, to leave the milieu and the earth behind. From the perspective of the cosmic artisan, we can also retroactively reinterpret and reevaluate modern tendencies that were already present in pre-modern arts and crafts, albeit in a latent and disassociated state. If the contemporary is a disjunctive synthesis of heterochronic periods, it constitutes a drama in which all of the past emerges as our contemporary potential. We have already seen that the cosmic artist finds a precursor in the untimely becoming of the Mannerist craftsperson. Deleuze and Guattari's example is Tintoretto, the little dyer, who materialized the human in relation to non-human forces, and whose materialist absence of self-absorption Jean-Paul Sartre liked to oppose to the grand seigneurial Titian. They thus partake of a speculative art history, the attempt to re-narrate multiple art histories according to their anachronistic logic and diffractive perspectivism. All history is really the history of perception, and what we make history with is the matter of a becoming, not the subject matter of a story. In the aggregate state that is the contemporary, we can envisage a Mannerist genealogy for a metamodern crafts and craftsmanship, no longer a professional, but a transdisciplinary marker and researcher. Today's artisans' gentle unruliness and experimentations tend towards a new unity of the arts. Given the tensions brought about in matter form, relationships by contemporary digital design practices, this involves a retrospective problematization of the division of labor between design and craft at the very moment it first appeared. What emerges is an informal and cosmic dimension in both Mannerist and meta-modern craftsmanship, characterized by an infinite and continuous variation of manners rather than forms. So there's an interesting line in there that all history is really the history of perception, and what we make history with is the matter of a becoming, not the subject matter of a story. And this is where, if you imagine, every new movement or style in architecture believes that their idea of space is the final form of space. But we actually live with the previous conception of space and the new conception of space laid uncomfortably over the top. And it's a false view, because if you imagine you had flat art like in icons, and then people developed the perspective in painting, like the vanishing point, and then it progressed and so on. But from that view, every period has its own different conception of space, but it's only a perception. If there is a real space, it was always the same all through time. It's only our perception of it that is changing. And Mannerism is the problem conception between the very late Gothic and the classicist idea of space that is the late Renaissance, which is a late elaborate Gothic. And then what's coming in is the return to the classicism, and that classicism is laid over the top of the Gothic. And in fact, it literally is in architecture. The structures of the buildings are Gothic, but the ornament, the decoration that's being stuck on them is classicist. So you've got these two different conceptions of space laid uncomfortably over the top of each other, and that is Mannerism.
That goes back to the earlier discussion about the movement from handicrafts to Bauhaus. That touched on your triplicate figuration of how there is first a primitive, here it would be the primitive handicrafts. Then there is a rationalization of it, which would be the Bauhaus.
You can also think of, there's another little thing in between the Art Nouveau and the Bauhaus, and that is a style called rationalism in architecture. And then the Bauhaus comes out straight after that. The Bauhaus is the vulgar, because then it's everywhere. Every house has a tube steel chair in it.
Previously, I was thinking of the Bauhaus as the rationalization because of the mention that Bauhaus, by contrast, was probably the first major attempt to combine specialized craft workshops with industrial manufacturing and capital investments. So I was thinking of it as a rationalization of the handicrafts because the handicrafts are then specialized, and that must take a certain level of breaking down the handicrafts, saying what is good handicraft work, what is bad handicraft work, and the like.
What is affordable to make? What can we fabricate in the fastest possible way? What I'd say is you can read it as Ruskin and Morris are primitive. Then the Art Nouveau is the rationalization of their ideas, and actually De Style is very late Art Nouveau, and the Art Nouveau has two movements within it. Then it turns into this square rational block shape by the end, and you have De Style, Theo van Doesburg. They're the last trying to do this arts and crafts, but they can't scale up. And then the vulgarization, the commonization is the Bauhaus movement.
Because the capital investments and the mass producing, so it's just goddamn everywhere and becomes vulgar.
It absorbed it and spat it back out. Absorbed it, reified it, and put it back out. And the Bauhaus architects, they put the Bauhaus movement or school from 1919 to 1933. Also part of the term capitalist realism. There's also this art movement in Germany and in the Low Countries, Scandinavian countries, it gets called Neusachlichkeit, the new sobriety. How after World War I, you have the surrealist movement in art, the Dada, that's actually going on in World War I in neutral Switzerland, and then it takes off a little bit after, and it's a revolt against sending people into the meat grinder of war, which is pointless. And after World War One ends, then the surrealist movement dies off, and you have this next movement where people accept the capitalist modernist reality. And the art style in that period is quite dark, and it's called Neusachlichkeit, meaning the new sobriety, or literally the new objectivity. And you see it also in the architecture, and it's a little bit Bauhaus. When you look at Bauhaus architecture, it's actually very austere. It's making sparse use of it's as little metal as possible, and thin skeletal frames and glass ladder windows. A lot of the Bauhaus architects run away to America when World War II starts, and because the art surrounding them is seen as degenerate art by the Nazis. And the Bauhaus evolves into a style called New International or New Business, and that is the architecture of the skyscraper. But that architecture actually has its roots back in the earlier neo-Gothic of the late 1800s and the Art Nouveau, where the buildings start to go up and get taller, and they have better materials, better design. And you'll see there's a period after the 1860s, buildings start going back up. They have these little towers on them reaching, or little parapets there in the Art Nouveau, in the late neo-Renaissance style, 1880s, reaching up again, and they're the foundation or the groundwork for the skyscraper.
Alchemy. If Mannerism elevated mechanics into the sphere of the formative idea, today different and new machines are capable of acting as formatting forces. With every new medium or technology, there's a reciprocal deterritorialization between hand and material. Documenting in breathtaking detail the very history of their creation and transformation, David Quayola's Captives offer a contemporary interpretation of Michelangelo's Non Finito. They shift the focus from the all too familiar sculptures to how technologies introduce new tensions and manners in the formal articulation of matter. Ultimately, it is not ideas that inhabit matter, but other materials. They always do, though, in an unpredictable and differentiating manner. This is what makes it interesting today to speak of new crossovers, such as digital handmade, digital Gothic, or digital. This is interesting because this touches on something Lior literally posted in their Instagram story today. They said, quote, "The play of technologies is just so essential to art itself, we can barely look at tools as, quote, for us, end quote, anymore." The operational use of algorithms and computer-controlled robots is not simply a means to an end, that is, a means that allows us to produce forms that were impossible in the past, but a means to a means that generates unpredictable ends and endlessly evolving forms. Due to their operational use of generative code, digital technologies allow for infinite and continuous variation. While canonical distinctions impose the theoretical opposition of form and matter and assign art and craft as their own respective media, synthetic materials such as canvas, paper, and oil versus natural materials such as wood, clay, fiber, but also blood, earwax, and elbow grease. These oppositions are therefore always already bypassed in practice by an intermediary dimension that is energetic and molecular, something Deleuze and Guattari describe as an objective zone of fluctuation that is coextensive with reality itself. In this zone of indetermination, fine art and applied art, design and craft converge in an abstract and machinic constructivism. They converge with life itself, that is, life understood not as mysterious self-subsistence, but as something always modally outside itself, as the open movement of formative ideational forces inherent to matter. Or again, life not as property of organic creatures, but as something that erupts in between the creations in which it is implicated and explicated across many modes.
Life not a property, but something that erupts. That's rhizomatic thinking.
I don't remember the thinker, but somebody called Deleuze's rhizomes potato fascism. And it is interesting because apparently the IDF has used the idea of striated and destriated space in their bombing of Palestine.
Yeah, they've used rhizomatic warfare, and they actually read in the military schools Deleuze and Guattari. And I can partly explain it. It's basically, say, if you have a house full of enemy combatants, and then you dug a tunnel under, and then you came up inside the house next door, tied up the people in the house, and then you punched a hole in the wall and shot all the enemy combatants. That's rhizomatic warfare, because you're bursting through, or you might burst through a roof. If you think of a Navy SEAL attack on a compound, that's rhizomatic as well. But when you actually think about it, warfare has always been rhizomatic. It's been cannons punching through a wall and then a group of people running through the wall into the city and attacking everyone. Now it's just on a smaller individual kind of scale of house to house.
Or another mode with the striated space is the idea that it's just easier to bomb out a bunch of urban infrastructure and then invade the space once it's basically rubble, and once you've captured the area, rebuild from the ground up. But what you're saying is right on point, that a lot of warfare is Deleuzian to begin with. So one of the counter arguments with this is Deleuze's idea of striated space. These have been tactics that have been etched out previously in warfare manuals.
It was always done on a greater scale, but now today, when you think about so-called terrorist warfare, it's more on the individual scale of the individual house rather than the whole city being invaded. They're both happening, but yeah.
More than with Michelangelo's Non Finito, Florentine lines, or Venetian colorism, this informal but vital dimension of craftsmanship already became clear with Mannerist sculptors such as Bernard Palissy or Benvenuto Cellini, and later generally from Goethe to Richard Sonnet being regarded the quintessential craftsperson. Both Palissy and Cellini were marginalized due to sculpture's lower classification in the Paragon debate and traditionally count as examples of decorative art.
I can just explain really quickly the Paragone debate. Paragone means comparison, but it was an argument between the different forms of art in the Italian Renaissance. And it's where architecture, painting, and sculpture were all championed as the superior form of art, superior and distinct from each other.
In reality, they were all the more ambitious. Adopting the old idea that alchemy and the arts are the same, current in both Paracelsus and Dürer, they engaged in manipulating and operating on nature itself. Like many scholars, glass blowers, ceramists, and enamelers of their time, they sought a fusion of their own flesh with the material of their creation, the word creation being understood in its double meaning as both the act of creating and the result of this act, such that it is never an instant conception, but rather an ongoing operation, an open-ended metamorphic series. In fact, while many historians of science have taken account of the significance of metalworking and the artisan's bodily encounter with matter to the development of modern experimental chemistry, it is not certain that this significance has been grasped to its full extent. For what is truly modern about alchemy is perhaps not the scarce truths it produced about chemical processes based on metalwork, but its practical efficacy as an itinerant or minor science. The task of art, Cellini said, is to test the earth, to isolate, capture, and harness its form-taking forces by means of the liquefaction of its metals. As a smith, he knew that form is never separable from matter, but that it comes to the fore as a flow, being as much artificially constructed as it is natural. His bronze Perseus is therefore not carved, but cast. On the one hand, he could not think of the Perseus as a matter of recognizing the form to be extracted from a single piece of stone, but the act of metallic fusion offered him a way to emulate the accomplishment of a monumental piece without using joints. The demand for material unity is maintained in managing a single pour, rather than casting the Perseus in sections. In this way, on the other hand, Cellini also discovered something no stonecutter could explain, namely how to animate his sculptures and resuscitate his figures from the dead. According to both ancient and alchemical belief, liquefied metals are the lifeblood of the earth, trapped and congealed in it. Thus, liquefaction was the very method of freeing the soul that infuses the clay of the earth and of bringing bronze to life. As a conjoining of movement, liquidity, heat, and life, artistic instauration is a spiritual experience. It becomes one single metallurgic performance sustained by variation itself, animating its material not with souls inhabiting bodies, but with an unlocalizable and omnipresent flexibility. The cast is rigid, but the procedure of casting obeys a practical logic of affordances and remains subordinate to the channeling of the pour. What does brick want? Louis Kahn would later ask. In Art of the Earth, an essay included in the Discours Admirables, 1580, Palissy similarly explained how he seeks to channel life itself into clay. A geologist, author, and potter, he brought together making, knowing, and sensing, and regarded ceramics as a new medium for philosophical inquiry into terrestrial and organic processes by which minerals, plants, and animals are born, die, and fuse their immortal traces into rock. In his procedure of casting teeming pond scenes, experiential knowledge converges with material practice. It goes without saying, however, that the knowledge thus acquired is not reproducible knowledge about the world, but, as Patricia Falgueres calls it, a strictly speculative knowledge.
I'm just going to throw this picture of the bronze on there just before the Michelangelo and the whatever the other person's name was with a Q. So this is the Cellini's Perseus, and those first two are the modern people trapped in a thing, and then the earlier ones are the Michelangelo, the not quite coming out of the trapped in the sculpture.
Art in the Palissy workshop is a mode of operation that seeks perfection not in the things imitated, but in the virtuoso imitation itself. Iterability becomes a power of the false that is turned against the eternity of the model, such that the difference between products of art and natural objects can henceforth only be made from the perspective of their construction in a kind of second eternity. In his study of Palissy, Ernst Chris, a true minor art historian in the Deleuzo-Guattarian sense of a historian of practices, points out that Palissy regarded nature itself as an infinitely reproducible prototype and art as not made by human hands, but occurring through a natural mode of production that the craftsperson could nonetheless imitate. As a consequence, no doctrine of ideas, general knowledge, or pre-established model could authorize the work to be done. The molding operation seems to be an immediate expression of the breakdown of sense inherent to the clay's fragmentary and aleatory disposition. But simultaneous with the appearance of the Wunderkammer, the casts of vibrant ponds mark a triumph of assemblage. Like living fossils, the ceramic glaze makes everything, stupefying aggregates of fish, serpents, lizards, arabesques, interlacings, angels, volutes, and masks, detach from its material and enter into strange, unnatural churnings. Image and material coincide in a system of opaque signs, traces of cosmic themes that can be combined in endless variation. Alchemy has had a lasting influence on modern art, from surrealism to Anselm Kiefer and from Sigmar Polke's Art of Separation and Fusion to Yves Klein's interest in the alchemical roots of oil paint with pigment and dyes as materia prima and the sponge as a zone of immaterial pictorial sensibility where matter and spirit interpenetrate. In the late 1960s, the old concept of the artist-alchemist itself resurfaced with Germano Salante's interest in art povera as the recycling of garbage, and its transformation into art opened the work to both social and natural processes. It is taken up in Gordon Matta Clark, a 2009 to 2010 retrospective of his work at the Pulitzer Foundation was entitled Urban Alchemy, and more recently in Wilhelm Munn's Trash Stones, a series of abstract and amorphous lumps, Klumpen, beginning in 1989 with Stone 001 and running well into the 700 stones at the time of writing, composed of the hybrid production waste from the artist's studio but coated in colored fiberglass reinforced plastics. They conjure up visions of serial production processes as well as an enigmatic and magical presence. Shiny and reflective at first, their surfaces quickly reveal their multi-layered composition as they are wrapped around an inner core of wood, duct tape, discarded sculptures, but also broken electronics and personal items, which are all compacted together and preserved like the fossils of our time. That almost seems like it resembles the composition of Melville's book. The fact that there's all these different styles thrown together into one novel. If contemporary alchemy is a secret knowledge of nature, this is because it seeks to know its material conditions from within. It is to intuit how to pass from one mode of existence to another. Working directly with the bowels of the earth, Cellini and Palissy too are geo-artists who do not reproduce or reiterate pre-existing forms in varying materials. Rather, forms are open on either end, both toward the pragmatic depth of the soil from which they are nourished and toward the aesthetic heights of the cosmos. Speaking with Deleuze and Guattari, they channel and follow the earth along trajectories of itinerant creation. To itinerate is to make the material itself work rather than oneself working at the surface of matter. Instead of the concatenation of carefully distinguished operations typical of the rational organization of labor, we are dealing with uninterrupted gestures that are contrapuntally related to the complex and variable behavior of materials themselves. As in metallurgy, there is no division of labor between conceiving and working because cognition itself is a surveying and following of material inferences. The artisan's design is a serial movement of which we can say only retrospectively that the first term of the series is the subject of the work and the point of arrival the object of the work. Only when the movement is stopped, when the matter flow is submitted to rigid stratification, does the artisan cease to be a designer and become a mere worker or laborer. Writing for the biotechnical individuals of our own age, the alchemist philosopher Simondon argues that a moving matter or material is detached from the matter-form model at the same time that the technological operation is detached from the labor model. Life is not only concerned with technology, but co-emerges with it. As a consequence, technicity is not reducible to automated work, the imposing of stable form on passive and indeterminate matter to be worked. It is the milieu of informal compromises by which life's material processes are integrated from one metastable state to the next.
A key term for understanding artisanry in Simondon's concept for these processes is modulation. Just as, Palissy, ceramics is a practice that resists all ontological determination, and for Cellini, the superiority of working directly in terra is that his material is always subject to deformation. To modulate is always about molding in a continuous and variable manner instead of working with a pre-established mold. Rather than imposing a form by way of a command, it teases it out in collaboration with the complex and variable behavior of materials themselves. To express their morphogenetic potential is to pair their existing patterning into abstract, plastic tendencies or forces. These tendencies are like accidental and implicit forms within a vectorial field, where they are inseparable from topological operations of deformation. Thus, by means of folding, stretching, twisting, bending, shifting, delaminating, curling, bulging, rotating, merging, splitting, heating, hammering, mixing, or any combination of these movements of repetition and variation, the singularities of metal, for example, are made to converge upon traits of expression in the non-definitive mode: toughness, rigidity, elasticity, plasticity, brittleness, porosity, redness, and so forth. Modulation is thus a perspective or visionary technique. It is the activation of a non-cognitive schema of concretization imminent to a material's becoming. By operating a more or less developed material, the artisan discovers that materials not only have their own lively existence, but also depend increasingly on the informational assemblages through which they circulate. All sorts of external forces get expressed in novel forms that can be produced only through this very material. To speak of modulation instead of molding, in other words, is to see things in terms of interaction and interpenetration. Cellini's metallurgic performance, the work of metal to be done, brings into play at least three disparate energies or forces which act on a new plane of composition: the strong energy of an amorphous metal, the weak energy borne by the mold, which now functions as a continuous force and acts as information that guides and follows the transformation of the material, and, decisively, the coupling energy that brings about the taking form between material and form, achieved only by the artisan. If we forget the third energy, we end up applying a sociological model based on class blindness to a technical context. The individuation is initiated by someone or something who brings together material and form, not as a synthesis of two distinct states of matter, but in the form of a transduction that maintains the productive asymmetry potential of the different durations while pulling them forward over a threshold to a new level of resonance. Every mold, in other words, is an invention, not something given, but demand for instauration. While matter is composed of a fixed distribution of thresholds of molar aggregates, or well-formed genera and species, such that each form can be the content for another form ad infinitum, metal reveals matter as a material flow, a strictly mechanic phylum that forms the outside of all phylogenesis. This has to do with the conditions under which our intuition is capable of grasping matter as a material flow. While in everyday life, our intuition is subordinate to organic action and matter is perceived as formed content, it needs non-equilibrium conditions to become manifest. These conditions are found in the confrontation with metal, the fluidity of which resists external forces and generates its own effects, keeping a historical record of its past in a way that most fluids cannot. Because of this material productivity or expressivity, it is not the metallurgist who has consciousness of the specific qualities of metal, it's the sympathy or antipathy with metals that brings matter to consciousness. The mechanic phylum constitutes the great solidarity between metallurgists of all ages. As Ruskin puts in his lyrical essay, The Work of Iron, iron is ductile and tenacious ground we feed from. And as a combination of earth and air, body and soul, its oxide is the very stuff with which nature paints. For both Palissy and Cellini, metals are full of local transformation and instability. They are more fluid than fluids. At the same time, they flow more slowly and more profoundly and more irreversibly than other fluids. The metallurgist expects metals to behave idiosyncratically in each particular case to make a practical difference. In other words, metals somehow resist external forces and engender their own effect. They generate relations just as much as relations generate metals. Metals contain historical records of their past, paths of deviation and translation, in a way that most fluids cannot. This gives them a metastable existence. By means of informational enrichment, they can be made to solve specific problems that multiply their forms of existence. In his glazes, Palissy fused generative salt and congelative water into strange aquatic and amphibic syntheses. Salt, he held, is an unknown and invisible body, like a spirit, and yet occupying space and sustaining that in which it is enclosed. In turn, Cellini's Celeria, salt cellar, renders visible the composition of salt as metallic synthesis of the two flows of earth and sea, all the while exposing the transmutation of salt into a commodity due to its convergence with the flows of coinage. Salt functioned as tax currency. And Francois I's expansionist trade policy. It thus anticipates the omnipresence of metals in our technical and cultural forms of life, from microprocessors to solar panels, and the bionic embodiments of metallurgic technologies that we cyborgs have become. Based on this special primary relation of deterritorialization between the artisan and the metallurgist, perhaps we can understand the subjectivity of the meta-modern artist as an alchemical process rather than as a stable function. If, between ideas and their materialization, there are only iterative processes and stepwise methodologies, then modernism is an active, evolutionary materialism. Something Guattari, following Marx's definition of the relation of human labor with nature, called a metabolism of the infinite. Like all Mannerists, Palissy and Cellini are of course extremely self-aware artisans, but they do not transcend their planes of consistency, populated with the flows of ore, the vicissitudes of the market, and other socio-political forces. Best, they intervene in what eludes them. They deterritorialize the distribution of flows from the inside out, working inside the mod, that is, in metallic assemblages of various speeds. Their starting point is always the relatively unformed and indeterminate flux of materials. Similarly, Gottfried Semper's old Stoffwurst theory, according to which buildings are not made out of textiles, but textile has been transmaterialized into stone and steel, is rediscovered by some designers today. After metallurgy, Semper's is perhaps the first general theory of the transformation of materials in design that replaces hylomorphism with morphogenesis. The development of form is not a linear, progressive relationship, since its principle of individuation is itself serial and processual. Since textile weavings and bundles are carved from stone and molded in steel, there is a shift from one technique to other. Yet textile stone and steel, as relatively formed matter, are only intermediary states in an infinite series of transformations. Since one technique does not make sense without the other, the architect has to follow their continuous development straddling the various disciplines. Beyond simple technique, what makes the thought of art and the chaos of forms intersect in the work is an abstract spiritual zone between material states that is best called style. As Spoyblock comments, all the material is animated, not by souls inhabiting matter, but by flexibility living within rigid matter, textile inhabiting stone, weaving inhabiting carving, carving inhabiting drawing. Again, work is not located, not in a class or a pair of hands or even in human beings. Work is continuously displaced and boundaries blur. It is omnipresent and therefore spiritual. While various techniques can inform a manner, the latter has to be conceived as the abstract and operative, as opposed to structural, unity of composition of media. This is the very essence of Mannerism. Manner is the leading edge becoming, of deterritorialization. It is the excess of expression or practice over content. This absorption of matter by a manner that amends rather than imitates means we pass from a reductive to a generative notion of modeling, or what Guattari has called metamodeling. Metamodeling refers not to a schematic representation, but on the contrary of the spontaneous remingling of acquired regularities of materials with the emergence-level chance and indeterminacy from which they evolve. Carl Guismet, for example, replaces form with formation by working with a foam that retains a memory of its past. Arandelash work with a crystallographic structure is an organizing force. And with the mycelium chair, Eric Clarenbeek combined growing material derived from protocells with 3D printing. After metallurgy, then, contemporary designers use new materials to blur the gap between the non-living and the living. Besides engaging the right materials, however, they also need some tactical or plastic methods, tools, technologies, and concepts to accelerate matter or slow it down. These tools of configurability can be of varying levels of abstraction, from an algebraic alphabet compared to alchemy's mathesis, in which material articulation and mathematical calculation are mutually implicative, for probabilities and possibilities, to CNC systems and simulation software. But what is crucial is that, being both instrumental and constitutive, they are not representational, but constructive. They mediate and effectuate what they are about. As Luciana Parisi says, there is a continual adaptation or contagion between algorithms, mechanical arts, and real-time physical movement. Design itself becomes technical when coding becomes media literate or reflective, and when metamodeling becomes the integral speculative practice that returns its processes to the field of its own emergence, from which it regenerates it, just as it constructs new figures and forms. In this last paragraph we just read, when it brought up these three different works, it reminds me a little bit of an artist, Eduardo Cap. And one of his most famous pieces, because he considered himself a bio-artist, or as a term he used for himself, because he wanted to shift the relationship between the consumer and an art object towards an art subject. So in 1997, for example, he was one of the first people to microchip himself and upload himself to a animal database, pets and stuff. And a couple of years before that, he put a USB drive inside himself, uploaded a bunch of family photos, images from his personal life on there, and at any time anyone could go on the internet and just look at those files that were inside him. And I think one of the most famous exhibitions he did was called Lola, or GFP Bunny. P in this case stands for green fluorescent protein, a particular protein that was extracted from jellyfish. It's the reason that they have bioluminescence, so that they can glow in the dark. Scientists have been extracting this protein for ages. The technique was already well established, and Eduardo commissioned a lab in a French laboratory, Avignon. It was like 2002, 2003, and he asked them to inject this protein into the zygote of a bunny whilst it was still in the womb. The bunny was otherwise perfectly healthy, a very normal bunny, but she'd glow green in the dark. And the reactions to this were really negative. The mildest reactions were like, why? And the most severe reactions were like, how fucking dare you play God? Because a lot of people saw this as a frivolous waste, playing of God, and like some genetic risk and danger. And Eduardo wanted to look after the bunny, but the French authorities visited his place and then killed the bunny. Whatever law was there at the time, they were scared of if the bunny bred, some kind of genetic deformity. That was the reasoning. But the interesting thing was, this work was being done in laboratories, not in secret, but obviously not publicized. But obviously it wasn't getting this reaction when people couldn't see it. But as soon as there's something living being presented in this way, the moral panic almost definitely ensues. And I was reminded of Lola, the GFP bunny, in this last paragraph, of this blending of not just materials, but of forms and of life with non-life. The mycelium chair and the memory foam. Sorry, the bunny's name was not Lola, it was Alba.
The bunny was white, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because alba is the Latin word for white.